right. So this is I guess what we call a short cast, right? It's an opportunity for us to reflect on some of the guests that we've had. It's July right now. A lot of people are off, and there's an opportunity for us to just kind of sit and see, what this podcast is about and what things have done and what we've accomplished so far.
Right. And so what we also want to do is that we do stuff behind the scenes that it's been interesting. We've had some really cool guests on. And I think what we can do is kind of talk through like what we do before, some of the things that we're doing in the studio, and then what we do after, and how we kind of put this whole thing together.
I like that. I want to go that way. And I think the first thing we need to do is reflect on the purpose of this podcast. For me, it's become two things. First, our primary purpose was to establish and kind of flip the TGIF culture on its head, right? Work on Friday, bust your ass, do what you can do to succeed. That's how we're going to do it. But I think what's happened is that we've had an opportunity to witness elite people and their greatness, and we've seen various formulas of success, and they've articulated it, and it's been an amazing opportunity, amazing time.
Well, I think we've learned a lot through this, and we talked through it. So one of the things from a behind-the-scenes perspective that we do is after each episode, we do a recap and kind of what you did well, what I did well, but also what we learned and what were like some of the highlighted points from the guest, from the interview, just immediately, like right off the bat, 90 seconds after we're done recording, we're like, hey, what were your takeaways? And I thought that was really kind of an interesting thing where we started to learn and understand what elite people are doing,
what they're doing
to become elite,
it's
and
really,
what they've had
cool.
to overcome. Yeah.
Well, let's dive in. Let's dive into an example. Our first guest, I believe, was Kyle Williams.
Yeah.
Right. Was there something that jumped out at you throughout the podcast?
First with Kyle, I think just from from our perspective, we didn't do anything. Like we just started this podcast and we just like sat down and started asking questions. Right? Like that was literally how this podcast. We knew what we were going to do. We were going to do a podcast. We knew Kyle was going to be the first guest.
Yeah.
But we really just sat down and it was so natural.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Kyle is just such an easy interview because you can ask him a question and he goes into several different layers. He has that gene from a GM. Right. So his family and his upbringing taught him how to articulate and speak in a way where it almost felt like we were part of a media group, and he had been trained for that since he was 2 years old.
It's exactly what I wanted to hit. Like the thing that jumped out at me, he was literally raised for this. He was born in the pro world, and what an awesome it was a blessing for him to be the first one. Because yes, it looks so smooth, but goodness, he's literally a professional.
Well, that's what I was talking about, is how bad we probably were as people that are interviewing.
He made us look good.
Yeah.
He was so natural and was able to take his story, and God, what an engaging story. It was phenomenal. But what I took from his episode was the fact I was fascinated about how he was trained and born for this. And reflecting on being his agent, now it was interesting. For me, I was like, it was never very difficult to get him a look.
Yeah.
It was never very difficult. It's usually pretty freaking difficult. Once you get cut once in the league, it doesn't matter who you are. You have this, your brand changes. The psychology changes. I don't know what exactly it is, but something changes. And yet, Kyle, it seemed like teams just always liked him, and I didn't really understand exactly what it was. I mean, certainly don't get me wrong. He was a phenomenal athlete. It was fun to watch him run. Like, he was just so fluid. His speed, his quickness, everything about him was amazing. But there's a lot of guys on the street right now in the NFL that have his speed, that have his strength. So what was it? Well, maybe it was the fact that teams trusted him to be a pro.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the other thing that I would take away is if any guest epitomizes getting knocked down and getting back up, I mean, this guy, all of the injuries, and even some of the things that happen on the field, right? Like what he would be known for from a 49ers fan perspective would be his drop punts in a playoff game that they were probably going to be favored to win the Super Bowl.
You have no idea how many DMs I got of people from the Bay Area going, I always wanted to ask that. He's like, thank you. And quite frankly, it was a platform for Kyle, from Kyle's perspective, to finally reflect on that and share his perspective. He never really got to share his perspective. And God, what a perspective.
Well, so interestingly, like right after the podcast, and it was our first one, so we didn't have a ton of expectation. We didn't know really what to expect from a guest perspective.
No.
Man, he was so fired up. He enjoyed it maybe more than any of our guests. And he kept talking about when's the next time I can come on. And it was really, I think, refreshing from our perspective, because we didn't know really what we were doing. I don't know that we still do, but I think from our perspective, to see his enjoyment and see his delight in what we had just, I don't want to say accomplished, but what we had just done and gone through, it was really awesome. It
was cathartic. I mean, he felt like it was something that he needed, and it was awesome for us to be able to provide that. It was deep. It was cool.
It was. Yeah. He's a great guest, because you can ask him a question like, hey, where are you from? And then he goes on for 5 minutes and talks about some of the background and some of the things that he had.
Super fun.
It was awesome. That was a great episode. So transitioning into our second guest, which,
oh boy.
Which I think from my perspective, and again, I think you and I both have met thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in our lifetime, and have been around some incredible people and have been blessed in all of those.
And you know when you know, right?
And meeting this guy, Lewis, and then going through the hour and a half that we had the opportunity in the studio to talk to him was incredible. So I'll give a little background, because we're talking a little bit about some behind the scenes stuff. So the first thing we want to talk about is what we're doing before to kind of get to know the guests. And I think we can just transition into that. Is we take all of our guests out to lunch. We take them to Bully's right across the street in Mission Valley, San Diego. And we're really, it's for some of us, it's the first time that for me, it could potentially be the first time that I'm meeting these guests. So there was a level of like him being reserved where I'm like, damn, this is going to be an interesting interview. This very reserved. And then he starts to open up, he gets more comfortable, and he talks about why, because of his prison experience, as to why he's reserved up front. He's eyeing you from eyeball to toenail. He's looking at you like, I need to scope you out. I need to see who you are. And within minutes, he's able to have a scouting report where he's like, I'm either going to trust you or I'm not, and then we'll go from there.
It's instinctive. Do you have that in business? Do you have instincts?
I think everyone has instincts, right? And it's just a matter of whether those instincts lead you down the right path or the wrong path. And again, it's not 100% either way. You just want to win more than you lose from an instinctual basis. But it was really fascinating to watch his instincts and how quickly, first of all, you're identifying it. If you have instincts and you have to make these determinations really, really quickly, you can also see from another perspective what they're doing, which I thought was, I mean, when we sat down to lunch, it was like, whoa, this guy, he's legitimately judging me right now, right? Like, and that's kind of fun. And then we started asking more questions. Let's jump in, because he was one of the most interesting human beings we've ever met. We talked about that right after. He was just fascinating.
Truly is. I think so let's go back to takeaways, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. I think for me, there were so many takeaways. He had so many reflective, fascinating thoughts. But for me, coming back to us, and what I think hit a nice place was his story about walking out of his USC class because he saw his business professor get in a raggedy Honda or something like that. And he's like, fuck this.
Why am I here?
Why am I here?
Yeah.
But it goes to a point that we talk about a lot. You know, USC arguably is a higher learning institution, right? And yet there's a distinction between education and practice sometimes. And there's a disconnect, right? We talk about it. I mean, we talked about it even today earlier. You joke around about, how you had kind of a shitty GPA, but you're a hell of a successful business person.
Oh, here we go. We had to bring that up, didn't we?
Well, no, but it goes to this point. It goes to Louis Ziskin's point. He recognized early on that there was a disconnect. There's a problem with education. If you were going to teach a business class, would you literally, order this textbook because we're going to do this? I would argue that. I would assume you wouldn't.
Well, listen, he didn't get a college degree, but he had a PhD in business. I mean, we walked out of this hour and a half sit down with this guy, and our eyes were big, like we had just witnessed something that we would never forget. And so if you haven't listened to this episode, if there's any episode to listen to, I think it's this one, because you're going to be a better business person. And just for some background, if you haven't, so Lewis was a huge ecstasy dealer and was busted in the biggest ecstasy bust from the FBI perspective, or what is it called, the DEA or whatever. The DEA busted him as the biggest ecstasy dealer in the world, or at least in the U.S., and he got himself out of prison. And so, I mean, it's just a fascinating story.
And just to point on that, even the fact that he's an ecstasy dealer, remember that literally was a solution to a business problem. Remember? I mean, he had a problem with cash and the cocaine. This was a way to offset. It was a solution. It was just amazing.
Well, you could tell just about someone being thrown into many different surroundings. One, this podcast, but more importantly, like his examples of how he was thrown into prison, and then how he was basically negotiating with the kingpins of the prison. So he was going to be taken care of. So within days, if not weeks, he became a made man where he was just taken care of. And so there was no worries. And he was able to so he basically took the kingpins and had the ability to pay their girlfriends in cash from people on the outside streets. And that's how he negotiated. So it was fascinating. I could almost say I learned more about business in that hour than you have in any other podcast or any other time that I've sat down with someone. And I've sat down with CEOs in all different walks of life. And I found him to be super brilliant and very, very like well attuned with what he was good at and then how to execute. So that's one thing that I think is important. And I don't mean to take up all the time, but the execution part of it.
Usually try anyways.
Yeah, I know I'm bogarting all the time here, but I think it's the execution part that I've been really fascinated with. Like, right? Like a lot of people work hard, but you actually have to execute. You have to take the hard work and then execute on it, right? Like there's a level of winning.
There's practice players.
there are. And there's a couple of times where some of the pro athletes have come in and said, there's guys that can practice and they're really, really good. Yeah. But it's when the lights come on, it's what are you doing when the lights come on? How are you performing and how are you executing? So whether it's sports or business, there's this level of have you won or have you lost? And people need to keep track.
You do. And you know, we would be remiss if when we were talking about Lewis, obviously, you know, I was shocked. We were talking and then he says, hey, I have to, you know, handle some stuff in Thailand because obviously one of the games that he's killing it in right now is the PPE game. And he had a glove deal out in Thailand. And next thing you know, we're getting Google News reports that he's been arrested by Thailand authorities. Holy shit. Literally 2 or 3 weeks, we were going to go visit him.
For attempted murder. So just as some context, after the show, we're going to take guests, and we'll give some more background on what we do before, during, and after. But after the show, we went out to dinner, and he basically invited us to Thailand because he wanted us to understand what this PPE game was all about. This was months ago, and we're obviously COVID, and there's a big business for this type of stuff. But he had explained what he was doing and what he was going to be doing in Thailand for a 6-month basically tour to maximize some profits during a time where you can really make some money in this stuff. And in a month after our podcast, a month after that dinner, he's literally arrested and he's in a prison for attempted murder in Thailand. And really interestingly enough, we're all sitting around kind of talking about what this podcast is going to be today. And he messages both of us on Instagram like, hey, I'm innocent.
Pretty fascinating.
Right? Like this was really kind of like, whoa, what's going on here?
By the way, I'm in full support of him and I wish him all the best. It's very fascinating to me from a legal perspective because there is a hell of a distinction between U.S. law and what goes on over there in Thailand. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this progresses.
But I mean, as you think about it, right? If there's anyone who could potentially get themselves like out of any situation, I mean, this guy is just a magician when it comes to figuring shit out.
Often, quite frankly, sometimes it's him revealing truth in the way that should be seen, right? I mean, that's how he sees things. So it's interesting.
He was just something else. I mean, that's one interaction with a human being I'll never forget. So moving on to episode number 3 was probably the most prevalent star that we've ever had on the show. So Bud Dupree came on, and why don't you take us through what your takeaways were from Bud's interview?
You know, my favorite story, and this is a little bit background, right? This is not while we were doing the podcast, but it was funny because his demeanor is unique. You met him, and you're talking. We did our lunch, right? And you remember, you're like, hey man, I got to talk to you for a second. And so we went upstairs to your office, and you're like, look, we're really gonna have to carry this. I'm concerned. I'm concerned he doesn't like talk that much. And I told you, I'm like, you know what? I had, there's this demeanor thing. I understand what you mean, but I promise you that when the lights come on, that guy lights up. It's unbelievable. I don't know what happens. Maybe it goes back to being an athlete and when the lights come on, but it was really, really fun for me to not only assure you that, but then have you watch that happen.
Well, it was one of my takeaways too. It was so funny because that's absolutely true, where I'm like, man, what are we going to talk about? And so from my perspective, because you already knew him obviously and invited him on and brought him in from Arizona where he was rehabbing. But when we got to the lunch, every question where I'm trying to engage, trying to understand who he was, it was one-word answers. And he was talking, because a lot of the times people that are coming on as guests are bringing friends, and they're using this as an opportunity, one, to come on the podcast, to have a great experience, but two is, we live in San Diego.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's not get it twisted. If we lived in Arkansas, we're probably going to have a hard time getting guests. We live in San Diego. So there's something about San Diego.
Sunshine and water are not a tough sell.
And there's beautiful babes. There's women.
There's everything.
And there's beaches. And there's nightlife. There's restaurants.
Yeah.
And then there's more beautiful women. So, I mean, San Diego is just a beautiful place to be. And so a lot of people want to come here. But that was an incredible takeaway. But I got to tell you, that's just a massive human being, right? Like, I mean, he's I think, huge. What is he, 6'5", 260?
6'6", 278.
Okay, not that you're counting or anything like that. No. Yeah, no, but he was an impressive individual from like a physical standpoint. And then you're right, when those cameras started to roll, there's a transformation that happens, and it's instant, and it's amazing to watch.
Awesome. It's awesome. And here's another takeaway that I had during that podcast. What a caring human being, a caring and humble human being. When we ask certain questions, I'll never forget. You're like, "Hey, what was the first thing you got? You got yourself as kind of like when you got drafted in the first round," and I got my mom a house. It was nothing for him. What did you get yourself? I didn't really. Well, my agent got me something, but he never. And this is true. He is always thinking about how he can lift up other people. And one of the things he said was some leaders are vocal, and some leaders like to lead through example, right? And I think he's the epitome of what he says he is.
Well, and interestingly enough, so he was more uncomfortable talking about himself, but he was more comfortable talking about his coaches, some of the family influence that he had, and I think that just goes to character, which is interesting because he's different than a lot of other people that we've had, where their time was many years ago. He was in the prime of his career, and a week later,
he was a week before we did this $85 million deal.
So if you're looking back on your life, right, when was the time where your ego was the highest?
I mean, come on.
When was
sports.
it? I'm asking. It was sports, right? Like there's this level of boisterousness, of cockiness, of almost arrogance.
By the way, that may be a symptom of culture, but we don't need to get into that. I mean, culture pushes athletes up too. I mean, they're celebrated,
which is almost like even more so of the astonishment of looking at it and saying, wow, when you come in and talking to us and being so humble and like there was zero braggadocio. He did not have any of that. And it was, and he knew, right? You're getting paid in a week when free agency starts. You're about to get paid. So there may be some level of confidence to that, of just where you've already, what you've done. You've already made some money, and you're about to get a really nice paycheck.
It's going to be really interesting. I'm going to say one thing that I also learned from him, that it's going to be really interesting to watch his season this year, because of one of the things he captured. I think he's one of the first guys to really talk about this, was the concept of a winning culture. And the locker room, and how the Steelers you kind of knew, and the Steelers as an organization, you kind of know you're thrown into this and you need to be a certain way. And now he's shifted to a totally different team, a totally different dynamic. It's going to be interesting to see how he leads that team, because he is a leader. It's just going to be interesting to see if they're successful.
Well, and Kyle was the same way, and it was interesting, Kyle, and we're going to transition into Guy next, but to see the NFL guys that we've had a chance to interview and talk to, and getting their perspective on what a winning culture is and what a culture that's not a winning culture, and those things, there's such a parallel to those and into business. And I've seen both, and so listening to them talk, they're the exact same thing, and that's why when we're talking to these athletes or people that have done really extraordinary things in life, what we're trying to do is ask questions to relate it to people that aren't going to play in the NFL or haven't, but no matter what they're doing in their lives, there's things that you can listen, you can learn, you can understand the perspective, and then if you can extract things that can really be impactful in your life.
You said something interesting. We were talking today about when you review a hire, right? That if athletes play a role, if there's an athletic background, it plays a role. What was it exactly that
it absolutely is. So I'm looking at it. There's a car, what is it? Enterprise. They only hire college athletes, right? Yeah. So they go out and I remember seeing them, and once they identify a college athlete, they call you forever until you actually either say no or you work for
I even
them.
got a call from them. It's unbelievable.
Well, I mean, that might have, we're going to have to call their HR department because you actually didn't play college sports. So, but what they want is college athletes because of the discipline and because of the competitive spirit that comes from college athletics, which I wholeheartely agree. Like we have someone on our team who's ultra competitive, and she's new and she played soccer at Clemson, and I could tell, and she's newer here, so she's looking at people that have been here for longer and they're more established. and it's driving her nuts.
Yeah,
and I'm watching this process go on mentally for her and how she's handling it. And she's just such a competitor that I'm enjoying how she's pushing herself to become better and better. So it's really cool to see. But kind of transitioning back, sports plays a huge role in competing and stuff like that. And Guy is our fourth guest, right? And he is so unique, and I'm excited to hear your takeaways from him. But mine was to be able to talk to somebody who had like hand-in-hand combat with Bill Walsh and Joe Montana, who I think are just two of the greatest like competitors of all time, and have the success to back that up. But it was interesting to hear his takes on what made them great. And aside from the Patriots, they were the greatest dynasty of all time. So tell me a little bit about what you thought from Guys.
Exactly. You know, I loved him digging into Bill Walsh. And it wasn't because, obviously, we're implicit Niners fans, right? We grew up watching the Niners. Bill Walsh is a celebrated coach, yada, 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 right? But to sit there and listen to a man who's literally experienced it, lived it, and was able to articulate things in such a way that was amazing. And let me give you an example. One of the things that'll always stick with me is Bill Walsh would always ask, "How are you doing?" You would always take interest in the person. And that was part of the winning culture. And for him to reflect that and then give examples of that and to say, and that's, by the way, touched my life in a way that I've applied it and succeeded and continued to succeed because of the culture that Bill Walsh brought. For me, that was an example of some really cool stuff.
So I obviously do a lot of training around leadership and development for myself because I'm a leader of a company, and I take a lot of pride and I feel a level of responsibility that comes with that. And listening to that made me go back to some of whether it's the teachings or the coachings that I've gotten in my past, and I've reached back out to ask specifically, what can I be doing a better job of? And so I've talked to some local CEOs to understand how they're actually doing it, because when you start to scale and you have a lot of people that, whether they report to you or they work with you, it's a lot, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. And how Bill Walsh was able to take a group, not just the players, right? So we talked to Guy, and it was the players, but it was the
dynamic.
It was the admin.
Yeah,
it was the guy that was taping ankles.
Yeah.
It was the guy who was mowing the lawn. It was every single one of those people, and whether it was the owner or the coach, having a relationship with everyone in the building, because they knew when you have everyone in the building operating at a high level.
Heartbeat. Yep.
At one heartbeat and with the same goals and intentions in mind, you have something that's it's like going good to great, right? It's like there's all this written material about it, but when you see someone who actually lived it and it was practical and you could take something away from it, and you're like, wow, if you talk to enough people that are great and you pay attention and you really listen, you're going to learn something. And I felt like listening to what Guy had to say about them and how their greatness transcended a sport, the sport, right, in America.
Yeah.
It was fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and we're learning, right? I mean, let's touch on what you just said. We're learning that, and I'm applying things, and I've it's funny, I've had moments where I've actually gone back and watched some things and go, holy shit, that was really good. I need to apply that and remember what we said.
What do you mean? Tell me more about that.
Well, for example, just I hearken it to getting up and get back down, and understanding that recognizing adversity is something that's really, really important to recognize. You got to, as Louis Ziskin said, right? You can either, when you're faced with adversity, you can either freeze or recognize the landscape. I mean, what excellent words of wisdom that was. I mean, that really, if you apply that to your life and you're feeling a certain way and you stop and go, why am I feeling that way? What do I have to do to defeat this? How can I win? If you just do that little bit, it changes your life.
I think a lot about like checkers and chess, right? Checkers and chess. And when you're playing chess, you're looking at 2, 3, 4, maybe even 10 moves away and what your opponent is going to do. And it's the same thing of reading people and playing poker and so forth. And I try to equate some of that stuff in business and strategy when I'm sitting down and talking to people in this studio.
Sure.
And it's super interesting because some of them don't even recognize what just natural gift that they have.
Sure.
Right? And so what we're trying to do is people that are interviewing and by the way, have no experience in doing this, and we are completely winging it at this point. But we have a inherent competitive spirit where we do want to get better, and we'll talk about that at the end, what we're doing to try to do that. But it's interesting to see people just with natural gifts and then trying to talk to them about it and some of the aha moments that they go through.
That's
so
great. Epiphanies.
All right, so we're going to move into our next episode, which I think was a really interesting one, which was Marquette, who you probably have the most intimate. I know him as well. We had a good a lot of experiences with him, but you knew him really well, and you were able to kind of extract some things from him. But what were some of your takeaways with the Marquette episode?
For me, I think the pivotal takeaway is looking at where he is in his career now. The question will always be, if he doesn't get another chance to play, he clearly was at a certain time the best in his position in the world. So for him not to get another opportunity, does that mean is that tragic? Is that tragic, and why?
I think we've got to be careful what we use the word tragic, right? Like the guy made millions of dollars in playing a sport.
True.
However, there was still this level of question on whether he recognized his responsibility and role in not having a job in the NFL right now, right? Because there is a level in any industry with any person. Yeah. Is that person worth the problem? If they're causing, if the noise is so loud,
you're right.
And so it was interesting to talk to him about that.
You're right, and I don't want to say the word defend Marquette, but I do want to touch on something, and this is from reflective insight of knowing him inside and out. The same thing that we're talking about that may have forced him out of the league. I think his finickiness, for example, his personality traits are ironically the same reason why he was as good as he was.
Sure.
So then you really kind of you step back and go, that's who Marquette is. And if potentially if teams step back and go, if that's who Marquette is, obviously they have to go through and juggle and everything. But I would argue that, his finicky nature, and I'll just, say that finicky is the word for now, is what made him great. And as interestingly enough, he's stepping into his music career, right? And he's just there's going to be a major announcement actually later today. One of his songs is actually going to be commercialized, and he's going to be good. And let me tell you, in the beginning of when he started doing his music, he fucking sucked. It was awful. And by the way, Marquette, some of your songs still suck, but some are actually really, really good. And he's taking, you want to talk about mentality and what we took from Marquette, he is taking what he did in football, and he's found another passion. And he's using that same drive, and I'll be damned if it's not working.
Well, that's interesting. So we'll go behind the scenes. Yeah. And when we went out to dinner with him after, one of the things as you talk about is creative. He lights up when he talks about the creative. Yeah. He lights up, so you could tell he was really, really happy doing what he was doing. So that was a takeaway. But when we go to the restaurant and he sits down, we're not sitting down for more than 5 minutes. He calls over the manager of the restaurant, and he says, "Hey, you're going to play this song on repeat."
Yeah.
And he had them play the song. So there's a level of like...
His song, not the song.
Sorry, you're right. Yeah. His song, for clarification purposes. But there's this level of belief in what he's doing.
Yes.
Like nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew what the song was. No. But in his head, it was the song to play at that time, and he wanted to hear it. And he was... damn well going to hear it at that restaurant.
I'll tell you, back in the day, that might have annoyed me, but knowing who he is, I appreciated that. I now appreciate his drive. You say, oh, do this, do that. It's like, no. That's his drive, and you have to appreciate it.
Okay, but I'll argue the point.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this point should be said, is that there is either a level of awareness that you have to be able to be successful, because what got you there may not get you to where you want to go. And
Fair point.
Understand that he was able to be successful because of some of this boisterousness, but when you're a punter, you do operate under different rules than the quarterback.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And so your noise can't be as loud as a quarterback, right? Like if Aaron Rodgers was a punter, he would never play in the NFL again. Right? There's just simple math. And again, it happens in business too. It's what's the noise surrounding you, and what is the value that people are getting from you being around? So
I agree.
Those are certain things. But it's interesting to look at somebody who's been at the top of their game and then now reflecting, because with age comes reflection, and there's
maturity.
But there was a time in that podcast, and it was interesting because I cut you off because I wanted to go back to it. It was. I cut you off a lot because sometimes you just don't know what you're talking about, and the questions are just so boring. I was just like, hey, I got to carry this podcast again. It's like, here we go again.
No wonder why your knees hurt. Yeah.
They do hurt too. But in that podcast, we talked about him in getting cut and some of the reflection that he had, and it was interesting because I've had these conversations with him outside of a podcast, and it was just like, didn't care, totally disregarded it, But now sitting down and actually getting his reflection years later, it was much more intimate, it's much more detailed in his reflection. And so super interesting to get his real takeaways as he's grown and matured.
Yeah, really. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what's next? Who do we have next?
Yeah, this one was near and dear to my heart because he's an old college teammate of mine. Oh, and when I say old, we're both old now. So that was really fun. This one was fun because I had obviously a lifelong experience with Rashied. And Rashied Davis had played at San Jose State, had barely played football before that, and then had gone through basically the most interesting maze of an NFL career where it started in arena, went to the NFL, and then he bounced around, played different positions, and just an incredible example of the mentality and work ethic where it goes to the point of what we're trying to talk about here of if anyone epitomizes like hard work, perseverance, dealing with adversity, and saying fuck everyone and everything. I am bound and determined to make this work. I know I'm as good as the guy next to me, if not better, and I'm going to prove everyone wrong. It's this chip on your shoulder. It's this, I think one of the takeaways for me, I've known him for years, like as a friend.
Sure. And
within 5 minutes of us sitting down and talking when the lights went on, we're talking about his dad getting murdered at a drive-through. I had never heard that story. I had never heard the story from his mouth. Sure. You kind of hear rumblings about it when you know him, but it was deep, and it was deep in a very short amount of time.
In the first 5 minutes, and that's the takeaway that I got. The one thing that will stick to me forever is what he said, that society teaches men not to cry. I couldn't cry, and he went. There's such depth there. Right? Men are taught not to cry. For him to just sit there as an NFL player and reflect within the first 3 minutes of us talking about a societal pressure that he wants to change was pretty fascinating.
It really was. And I think, with him having the experience, so we were able to kind of jump right in and then kind of understand and learn. But it is one of the episodes that I think we went really deep, and we started talking about social issues, the impact of his father's death, his career and dealing with injuries and not being a guy who's good enough. Talk about awareness. He knew he was not good enough to be hurt and then make a team, right?
So I'll never forget that phone call. I broke my hand.
Right.
And we had to decide no, you didn't.
Yeah.
No, you didn't.
and he was interesting because we had talked about like before, and we always ask, hey, is there anything off limits? And he's like, no, I'm an open book. Yeah. But he actually has some things. His history is deep, and there's certain things where he was like, hey, there's a couple
certain things we can't share.
There's certain things we can't.
I asked.
Yeah, you did, and we respect that, and so we don't cover things that are not comfortable enough to talk about because that's just not the podcast.
Here was for me what was cool and fascinating at the end. It came full circle from because he's very into societal things, right? We did go deep. For me, it was fun to listen as to why he established his foundation because it all clicked as to why he did it. He got taken out of a certain situation, was shown different things, and that changed his life in a positive way. And all he wants to do with Saturday Place is provide kids who are in the inner cities just a glimpse of something other than the inner city to give that hope, that one spark to change. That was some deep, cool shit.
Well, and it's also cool is when you see someone light up when they're doing something philanthropic and they don't. Like the difference between, I even asked him, I said, well, was the Super Bowl like the coolest day of your life? And he's like, no, we lost. And then it was like, okay, well, tell us about, is it Saturday School? Is that the name of it?
Saturday Place.
Saturday Place. And so tell me about Saturday Place. And he kind of, he perks up and he gets going. And it's because he's doing something he's super passionate about. So it wasn't the Super Bowl where, hundreds of millions of people are watching them. It's about like the real work that goes into it after the lights are off. Yeah. And that kind of epitomizes who that guy is, right? Like if there's going to be somebody who's working out when nobody else is watching, it's him.
Yeah.
And so that is one thing. Like I said it in the beginning when we first sat down, if there's anyone who epitomizes what we're talking about with this podcast, it's absolutely him. So let's transition into what's next with this podcast.
Well, and let's before we do that, I'd be remiss to say, like, do you like this logo?
Yeah, no, I do like the logo. It's worn on me.
Yeah, the guy who created that. I mean, it was pretty cool for him to be able to sit here. Sticker Farm, Ben from Sticker Farmer, as you recall.
How could I forget?
I mean, well, here's that thing that we literally talked about. Here's a guy that has been able to monetize the creative like no one has ever before. The role of the artist, like you said, traditionally is not one of riches, so to speak. And he's been able to capture creative and make it pop and monetize it. And it was fascinating. Because right now we talked about the fact how a logo expresses who you are, what you do. It's so important and yet so misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, originally I told you I had a problem with the logo because of looking at brand and brand association, and there's been actually guests that we've invited on, and because of the logo and some of the messaging.
We've been censored.
Yeah, we've
by
been
Facebook.
Yeah, we have been censored on some of the social media, which I take great pleasure in that.
Yeah, I do too.
But Ben was obviously he was the one who created the logo and the signage that we have here. But Ben was an interesting interview for me because our brains operate on two different sides, right? Left brain, right brain, and his creative is so overwhelmingly brilliant, and it's just the complete opposite. And I'm happy to tell you what I can do well and not do well. And it was just fascinating to see the dynamic.
For me, it was fascinating for you to embrace that, though. It was really fun for you to engage that and twist this into the business perspective of how things work. It was really fun for me to watch. So the takeaway from learning about Ben is really understanding kind of what you shared, which is, hey, look, creative content, all that stuff, it's becoming monetization, right? The platforms are monetizing things, and you better be aware and learn how to embrace artistry or however you do that, right? I mean, that's what I would take away.
Yeah, there was a lot of nuggets, and he was probably the most energetic and engaging and maybe the biggest performance of anyone that sat in that chair, because there's actually, if you look at it, our studio, it's pretty intimate, and there's been some large people that have come into the studio, and so there's not a lot of room to maneuver, and we're always trying to get the camera angles to hit right so we can put this on YouTube. And he didn't move a lot, but his personality filled up the room.
His presence is his brand.
Yeah,
his presence is his brand, and boy, does he put it out there, and I love it.
Does he also? There's this level of brand, and then there's this level of loyalty and a affinity towards him that was really fun to see.
A lot of depth.
Once we posted the episode, and once he listened to it and saw it, I think it was fascinating to see the level of momentum that he was able to get in such a short amount of time. And he's a marketing genius.
He really is. It's awesome. It's awesome. So what's next?
I think what we want to talk about is, well, I think because we just finished talking about guests, I think it'd be a good transition to talk about like what the experience is like and what the guests may get out of it, or what the experience can be like. So tell us a little bit about that.
It's interesting. We interviewed a couple of people to kind of help us with podcasts, right? And we've talked a lot, different ideas of, you should create this kind of thing or a situation where you have a pitch sheet, right? And things like that for me, I just no. For me, I don't believe in that necessarily. Obviously, I'm open to it, right? But at the same time, I think that what was important for me is to understand that you don't need a pitch sheet. What you need is a reason why someone wants to come on a podcast, right? And for me, and for this, it's the experience. It's number one, the fact that, hey, when we invite someone on, number one, we're going to take genuine interest in you. Number two, if you have a business idea out there, there's an opportunity for investment. Right? I mean, if you like, you're a serial entrepreneur, right? I mean, if you like someone's business concept, there's a reason why we're meeting. It's this is a fun thing to do. We want to talk about you, and we want to try to help people succeed, and we want to give back some of the things that we've been blessed with, and have this as a platform for people to learn. But there's a real experience here, and you may have a business opportunity that we want to get into.
So from the practical standpoint, to give people that are still listening to this, some context on what we're actually doing is pre-show. We're going to a lunch that we talked about across the street, and we're spending about an hour and a half casually talking, going through some stories, basically getting to know each other. And then we're going to come into the studio and we're going to record, and we're going to go over some ideas on an outline, but it's a really loose outline, right? And we're just going to say, hey, what's off limits, anything? And most people are like, nope, fire away. Then we're going to fire away in the podcast. We're going to just kind of raw and authentic and organic and see what happens.
Yeah.
And then what we're going to do is transition. So I look at it from the pre-show is getting to know people. It's kind of like a first date. Then you're actually, it's showtime and we're performing. And then we're going to go, and then we're going to expand on some of this stuff. Yeah. And we're going to take, and we've been going to Barbusa, which is a spot that
great Italian restaurant,
near and dear to my heart here in San Diego.
Great Italian cuisine. If you're ever in San Diego, go to Little Italy.
We'll get PJ on the podcast, or his dad, who's just an incredible,
awesome character.
Yeah, he needs to be on here. And then we're going to take him there, and then we're going to go much deeper and talk about specifics, not just about the podcast, but what are they looking to do? Whether it's, you have a marketing background where you understand how to monetize some of the marketing stuff and how to grow brand. And I'm going to talk about what entrepreneurial endeavors can we look at to where we can both potentially succeed together.
Where can we win?
And it's been funny. So where the podcast started was like, let's talk about mentality. What can we learn? Where is this going to go? From the inception, which was maybe a couple of months ago, to today, it has evolved and it has like progressed and changed in ways in which we didn't, or maybe weren't prepared for, which have been kind of the fun part about this.
The longer we go in process, the easier it is to crystallize what the message needs to be. And that's been really fun to crystallize things. I think we've got better and better to be able to really share what we're trying to do and the reason why we're here.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So we talked about what we think we're doing better. Yeah. What do you think we suck at?
I don't suck at anything.
But no. I mean, there's a lot of jokes I could throw out right now.
I think it's actually getting better at capturing what I'm talking about. The process is, I think we need to, sometimes we go off key, and I think we need to recognize when we go off key, so to speak. And we need to, well, I hate going off key. Yeah. No, I think we need to recognize when we go off and need to come back in and focus on what the listener is trying to gather from this. Because if you throw too much shit out there, they're not gonna learn anything. You got to kind of keep things razor sharp and limit it to maybe 2 or 3 concepts to try to go.
Yeah, no, and I think in the beginning because we were so new at this and we were trying to learn, as we've gotten more experienced at this, I think that is one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of succinct and be more intentional with what we're talking about, and then go a little bit deeper. So for me, what I don't like to listen to just in any podcast is just like okay, what have you done? And then they just kind of regurgitate some of the things that I could go on Wikipedia and find out, or just with anybody. It's like surface level stuff. Yeah. I like to go deeper. I like to figure out like what are some of the experience, what makes you tick, but also what are some, when you do some of these things, whether they be fantastically amazing and everybody's seen them and everybody knows you for these reasons, right? You're going to sign a huge free agency deal, but what's the impact that's going to have, and what translates to your family, to your friends? Like, how does your life change? Yeah. Like those things, going deeper has really been one of the things I think we need to continue to do a better job at.
We need to challenge that. We need to challenge that.
Exactly. That's a great word for it. Yeah. So we talk about the experience. So what are some of the things that you want to do as we transition into what's next? So we look at it as a 4-quarter game. We've committed to this for a year. We're about a quarter of the way through the year, and we have a lot of guests that we're super excited about that maybe you can name drop as we finish this up. Yeah. But what's next for the podcast?
Well, you know what I think was really important is to be cognizant of societal norms, and also be sensitive to certain things that society is trying to grow with. For example, we have yet to have a female guest.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to have a couple females, right? But it's been interesting that, and maybe it's because obviously we're naturally, well, I'm male naturally, but it may be that we're male. But the point is, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to provide this as a platform for every race, for every culture, for everything. And I think that needs to be a statement that we need to make. And I want to make that statement coming up to this next quarter.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we did a little bit of that with Lewis and getting who had a criminal background. Yeah. And then we also did it with the creative, with Ben, and seeing some of the different mentalities that can be successful and what they've done, and kind of trying to extract some of that so both of us can learn, but also hopefully some people that are still listening. And I think you're right, like the female perspective. So I'm in a coaching group, and there's 16 CEOs, and we all do something a little bit different. And it's so important. There was a time in that group where we didn't have any females, and it's not the same. It's that you're getting a lot of the same type of opinion, and women just have such a different view in a lot of different ways, and a much more caring and empathetic way to treat, whether it's to treat people, but also from a strategic standpoint. Yeah. And I got to tell you, they nail it. And it's going to be really important that we see some of that, because it's not just from the strategic standpoint and what they're doing. Again, it goes back to the point of it's go deeper and understanding how they're making these decisions and what the impact is.
I think traditionally there's when there's a perfect blend of an emotional reflection with logic, it's come to a good idea. It's fruitional.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, just from my perspective, I've seen you do a really good job as far as where we started and then, getting to this point. Sure. Hopefully you can accelerate that a little bit, because I do feel like I've carried the podcast for the last several months.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, thank you for that.
You see that? I kind of warmed you up a little bit and you thought,
I knew, but here's the problem. I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
That curveball, I was going to lay into it.
Oh, yeah. No, it was coming at your head that came straight to the strike zone. So, yeah, it's been fun. And I tell people that they're like, why are you doing a podcast, right? You're not making any money doing this. Why are you doing it? And I got to tell you, one, it's for the learning. Two, it's because it's been fun. Yeah. Like, there's just this level of fun that we're doing it. Yeah. Three is because we're doing a podcast in my business, and I had challenged Max, who works with us, to do a podcast, and he was just like never done it. He was doing it on his own, and I kept saying, well, if you're not willing to commit and learn it and do it, then how are you going to tell somebody else to do it? So it's been a lot of fun to learn.
Well, and talk about going deeper on things. There's one thing that you continue to say that I really listen to, and you talk about your time. And as you grow older, that your time is very precious to you, right? And as you grow older, it becomes more and more precious to you. For you to take the time to sit down and try this and have an opportunity to give back, I think is pretty fucking cool. And it's really neat.
Well, I appreciate that. I was waiting for the curveball to come, so I'm going to cut you off right there. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. But it is one of the biggest takeaways from age and experience and understanding and looking back on life and saying, you know what? When you used to chase money, now you chase time, and if you recognize that as soon as you possibly can in your life, it will have one of the greatest impacts. And so you start to think, like, what is the value in what I'm doing right now, and who is it? What's the time well spent with? Who am I going to spend that time with?
Guess what that does? It manifests happiness.
Right.
It manifests happiness, and people crave that and don't know what happiness is. First, they think it's the money. Then they get the money. They're still unfulfilled. But what you're capturing right there is really, really important.
Well, so it's interesting, right? You ask any parent that's ever had, kids and what they want for those kids, right? That no one ever answers that. Oh, I want them to be rich. Right. I want them to be wealthy. Right. Every single time I want them to be happy. So parents know, right? Their kids being happy and healthy are the two most important things. And so when you transition from looking at the riches in your life and how you're evaluating quote unquote success, it really becomes who you're spending your time with and the value you're getting out of your time. So you can create a happiness within your ecosystem that, to me, changes your life. Now, again, for me to do that, there had to be some level of success, because I needed a platform to where I was never going to be happy without that. Sure. And I knew that. So I had to create that first. And that was the thing. If I can check that off, then it became, you can transition into how you're spending your time and who you're spending your time with. That's going to be ultra important as you want to take this, for the rest of your life.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate it, everybody who's listened. This has been awesome. If you haven't checked out any of the episodes, this was one of the, we called this a short cast because what we wanted to do was kind of recap some of the things that we've learned, but also give everybody a chance to kind of go back. If any of these kind of recaps have caught your attention, we'd love for you to either download the episode, subscribe, wherever you get your podcast, check us out on YouTube. Hit us up on any of the DMs and let us know if there's any guests.
Yeah, I love it. I love it when we get questions like people will say, "Hey, well, what about this? What about that?" We'll continue. We may even incorporate that in the next quarter. Let's actually answer some of the questions for the prior guest before we get into the next guest.
It has been a lot of fun. I know we're wrapping this up, but it has been a lot of fun from the engagement, whether it's been from people that we either know or just random people. I mean, it was really fun to go to the restaurants a couple of different times and people would say, "Oh, I listened to this," or you go out and you're engaging and people are like, "Man, I checked this out. I love this episode." That's awesome. And you're right. Like, if there are questions or if there's guests that or if there's people that you think would be great on the podcast, or if there's just anything that we're not doing or could do better or that you like, just feedback is great. So hit us up, connect with us on all the social stuff. Hopefully you guys are listening and liking, and then we can continue to get better.
Yeah. I think that's a wrap for our short cast.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Cheers, brother.
All right. Cheers.